It began with a calendar entry that should never have existed outside palace walls. Within hours, whispers spread through royal circles that details of Catherine's private schedule had appeared in places they had no business being. What looked like an administrative mistake quickly became something much darker, and by nightfall, Prince William reportedly made a decision that stunned even veteran palace staff. Before we go deeper into what this really means for the royal family, make sure to subscribe so you don't miss a single update. At first, those closest to palace operations reportedly treated the situation as nothing more than an irritating administrative error, the sort of thing that occasionally happens in institutions that move through thousands of appointments, private briefings, and protected engagements every year. But according to reports circulating among royal correspondents, and various interpretations emerging from palace-adjacent circles, this incident felt different almost immediately. The information in question was said to involve movements connected to Catherine, Princess of Wales, details that were never intended to travel beyond a tightly controlled network. And that changed everything. Because Catherine's schedule is not simply a diary, it is reportedly treated as one of the most protected operational documents inside the royal ecosystem. Every appearance, private meeting, school visit, charitable engagement, and personal recovery window is understood to move through layers of coordination. Access is limited. Distribution is controlled. Timing is deliberate. So when fragments of those movements allegedly surfaced outside their approved channels, concern spread quietly but fast. Reports suggest the first signs came through routine administrative checks. Nothing dramatic. Nothing public. Just questions. Why had individuals appeared prepared for movements that had not yet been formally announced? Why were discussions occurring around dates that remained internally classified? Why did certain logistical details appear to exist outside expected circles? At first, palace staff reportedly searched for innocent explanations, a clerical error, an outdated draft, a scheduling overlap. But as internal reviews progressed behind closed doors, those explanations reportedly became harder to sustain. Sources familiar with royal operational culture describe an atmosphere of unusual urgency. Meetings that normally would have unfolded across days allegedly began taking place within hours. Administrative channels narrowed. Communication became increasingly selective. Staff who ordinarily handled portions of scheduling reportedly found themselves excluded from conversations. No public alarm was raised. But inside, according to various interpretations of events, something had shifted. Security concerns surrounding Catherine reportedly escalated almost immediately, not necessarily because any physical threat had emerged, but because uncertainty itself had become the problem. In institutions built on protocol, uncertainty can become more disruptive than confirmed wrongdoing. And then came the development that insiders claimed transformed concern into something much more serious. Attention quietly began moving toward one unexpected figure. Not a senior advisor, not a communications official, not a security officer. Instead, whispers reportedly began centering around someone rarely discussed publicly at all, a longtime personal aide, associated with Queen Camilla's household. No formal accusations surfaced. No public statements identified misconduct. But according to palace observers and circulating administrative interpretations, questions reportedly emerged around proximity, access pathways, and overlapping operational visibility between royal offices. That alone was enough to send tension through the corridors. Because royal households may appear united from the outside, but internally they remain structured through carefully protected boundaries. Information exists in layers. Access exists in layers. Trust exists in layers. Cross one boundary accidentally and procedures follow. Cross one repeatedly, and people begin asking different questions. It was around this point, according to reports, that Prince William became personally involved. That detail drew attention. Observers of royal operations have long noted that William is often described as measured, controlled, and reluctant to escalate internal issues publicly, which made accounts of his reported response stand out even more. Sources claim reviews accelerated. Internal conversations narrowed further. Decisions that ordinarily moved through administrative channels reportedly began reaching his desk directly. Staff, according to insider interpretations, started sensing something deeper than a scheduling issue. Not panic, not scandal, but rupture. A feeling that whatever had happened had touched something far more sensitive than a misplaced calendar entry. And by the end of that day, palace circles reportedly understood one thing clearly. This was no longer about who saw Catherine's schedule. It was becoming about who was allowed to see it in the first place. But the leak itself wasn't the real shock. The question was who had access, and why. Royal households run on silence, schedules, and trust. Break one of those rules, and the entire machine begins to shake. What had started as quiet concern inside administrative corridors was no longer being treated as an isolated mistake. According to reports and various interpretations emerging from palace observers, the discovery of Catherine's leaked movements triggered a second, more uncomfortable realization. This could not simply be explained by coincidence. Not because of what appeared outside palace walls, but because of what had to happen inside them for that information to exist in the first place. Those familiar with the structure of royal operations often describe schedules as more than calendars. They are protective maps. They determine who knows where senior royals will be, when engagements become public, how private time is shielded, and how the institution controls unpredictability. For Catherine in particular, whose public role reportedly expanded while maintaining unusually guarded personal boundaries, that schedule carried even greater sensitivity, and that meant access mattered. Reports suggest Catherine's movements did not pass through one office alone. Instead, they moved through overlapping systems: private secretaries, household coordinators, communications personnel, security teams, transportation planners, and selected administrative staff. Layers existed for a reason. No single person was supposed to see everything. That structure had always been viewed as protection. But now, some reportedly feared it had become vulnerability. According to insiders and various interpretations circulating among palace circles, internal access logs quietly became the center of attention. No announcements, no visible inquiries, just administrators reviewing timestamps, permissions, approvals, and patterns that normally attracted no attention at all. Questions reportedly began multiplying. Who opened documents? When were schedules viewed? Which versions existed? Who requested updates? Who received information they technically didn't need? People who had spent years operating in invisible efficiency suddenly found routine actions carrying unexpected weight. Sources suggest the atmosphere changed quickly. Conversations became shorter. Email chains reportedly narrowed. Requests that once took minutes allegedly required approval. Even harmless interactions began attracting second looks. Not because anyone had been accused, but because uncertainty itself had become impossible to ignore. And as administrative circles traced pathways of information, something more uncomfortable reportedly emerged. Boundaries. Royal households operate under formal separation despite appearing unified publicly. Different offices serve different principles. Information may overlap, but authority rarely does. Those lines are understood, respected, and rarely questioned, which is why reports of potential cross-household visibility reportedly created immediate discomfort. No one publicly suggested wrongdoing. No official statements described misconduct. Yet insiders whisper that concern wasn't centered on one individual, it was centered on process. Had information crossed into spaces it was never intended to enter? Were informal channels becoming too comfortable? Had proximity gradually replaced protocol? Those questions, according to reports, became impossible to dismiss. And somewhere inside that growing uncertainty, attention reportedly returned once again to the same uncomfortable point of discussion: connections linked to Camilla's household structure. Still, interpretations remained careful. No public confrontation. No direct blame. Only growing tension. Because once trust becomes the subject, every interaction starts looking different. Observers say this may explain why Prince William's reported involvement became increasingly noticeable. By most accounts, William has long favored controlled responses and institutional discipline over public reaction. But insiders suggest this situation felt different. The issue wasn't reputation, it was containment. Reports claim accountability became the private focus. Not punishment. Not spectacle. Accountability. Questions reportedly became sharper. Administrative reviews became narrower. Access expectations reportedly tightened. And for staff watching quietly from inside the machine, one feeling allegedly became impossible to ignore. Someone wanted answers. Not eventually. Immediately. Because whatever had happened was no longer being measured as a scheduling error. It was beginning to look like a breach of confidence. And according to those following events closely, that shift changed the entire atmosphere inside palace walls. Then came the moment insiders say turned concern into confrontation. No public statement. No dramatic announcement. Just one instruction delivered quietly and enforced immediately. By the time conversations inside palace administration reached their most uncomfortable stage, reports suggest the atmosphere had already changed. Staff were no longer speaking about possibility. They were speaking about procedure, not because conclusions had been reached, and not because anyone publicly admitted wrongdoing, but because institutions built on control tend to react long before certainty arrives. And according to various interpretations emerging from royal circles, this was the moment when concern became action. What happened next reportedly surprised people not because it was loud, but because it wasn't. There was no press briefing, no carefully worded palace update, no visible reshuffling announced to the public. Instead, reports suggest a single operational decision moved through internal channels quietly, and without ceremony. Restrictions were allegedly placed on access associated with Camilla's longtime personal aide. The wording matters. Restrictions, not dismissal, not removal, not accusation, just boundaries. That distinction quickly became the center of speculation. Sources familiar with palace culture claim language surrounding the decision remained unusually disciplined. There were reportedly no references to investigations, misconduct, or blame. Instead, descriptions allegedly emphasized review procedures, compartmentalization, and operational adjustment. To outsiders, that may sound insignificant. Inside institutions like this, it rarely is. Because in royal environments, limiting access is not viewed as symbolic, it changes everything. Access determines information. Information determines influence. Influence determines proximity. And proximity inside a palace has always meant more than location. Reports suggest the restrictions centered on limiting visibility into scheduling streams and tightening who could view sensitive planning channels moving forward. Whether temporary or indefinite reportedly remained unclear. But according to interpretations circulating among insiders, the meaning felt unmistakable. Contain the concern. Protect the system. Move first. Ask questions later. That approach reportedly led many observers to frame the move not as punishment, but as containment. An institutional firewall. The logic, according to some interpretations, was simple. If uncertainty existed around how information moved, reduce movement before determining responsibility. That explanation, however, created a different tension. Because containment implies possibility. And possibility creates questions. Questions about who knew what. Questions about who shared what. Questions about how long concerns may have existed before action happened. Reports suggest Prince William's role became increasingly visible during this period, not publicly, but internally. Palace observers have often described him as deeply protective of structure, particularly regarding Catherine's operations and the boundaries around their household. And according to insiders, this response fit that pattern. Not emotional, not explosive, disciplined, controlled, focused. Internal interpretations reportedly framed William's position less as defending individuals and more as defending operational boundaries. The issue, according to those readings, was not household politics, it was preserving confidence in the system itself. Still, even measured decisions create consequences. Sources suggest senior staff were caught off guard by the speed. Not because protocol reviews are unusual, but because reviews that reach visible access restrictions tend to signal something deeper than routine concern. Conversations reportedly became more cautious. Interactions became more deliberate. People began paying attention not only to what they handled, but who else handled it. And quietly, another uncomfortable thought began spreading. If access could change this quickly, had concerns been building longer than anyone realized? That question reportedly lingered in every interpretation that followed. Because once trust becomes visible, people start looking backward, not forward. And that is when speculation reportedly expanded beyond one aide, one office, and one decision. Because if one boundary had to be reinforced so quickly, observers began asking something much harder to answer, yet removing one aide raised a larger question. How much did others already know? For observers watching closely, Catherine's public composure only deepened the mystery. Because while conversations around access restrictions and administrative boundaries continued to circulate quietly behind palace walls, something else began drawing attention, and in some ways it felt even harder to explain. Catherine appeared unchanged. No dramatic adjustments, no visible response, no attempt to answer speculation. And according to reports and various interpretations from royal commentators, that silence became part of the story. People often misunderstand the role Catherine occupies inside the modern monarchy. Public appearances may seem simple from the outside: meet people, attend events, continue the schedule, but those familiar with royal operations frequently describe the Princess of Wales as someone whose position depends on consistency. Her public image is not built around reaction. It is built around steadiness, which meant that if disruption existed privately, composure publicly became expected. Still, observers began noticing what wasn't being said. Reports suggest scheduling procedures surrounding Catherine quietly became more controlled in the period that followed. Not publicly announced, not acknowledged. Just subtle operational changes interpreted by those who follow royal logistics closely. Appearances reportedly became more deliberate. Timelines allegedly became tighter. Information distribution appeared narrower. Routine engagements seemed increasingly insulated. None of that proves anything on its own. But institutions often communicate through patterns long before they speak through statements. And according to insider interpretations, those patterns became difficult to ignore. At the center of it all remained a difficult reality. Catherine has spent years balancing public visibility with unusually guarded personal boundaries. Her role requires access, familiarity, and connection, while simultaneously demanding privacy that few public figures can realistically maintain. That contradiction has always existed. But moments of uncertainty make it harder to carry. Reports suggest increased caution began extending beyond schedules themselves. Conversations around appearances reportedly became more measured. Administrative teams allegedly became more selective. Not because public duties stopped, but because predictability became something to protect. And throughout all of it, Catherine reportedly continued presenting calm, which to many observers only intensified speculation. Because calm under pressure can mean confidence, but it can also mean discipline. Media conversations reportedly split quickly. Some interpretations dismissed the situation entirely, describing normal operational adjustments inside a large institution. Others began asking whether unusual silence itself had become meaningful. Why no clarification? Why no visible response? Why did the palace appear willing to absorb speculation rather than shut it down? Questions multiplied. Answers didn't, and somewhere inside that growing silence, attention increasingly turned toward William. Reports suggest observers began noting what they interpreted as a more protective posture around Catherine. Not dramatic, not performative, but deliberate. His approach, according to palace commentators, appeared increasingly focused on preserving boundaries rather than engaging narratives. Not defending headlines, defending structure. That distinction mattered. Because protecting Catherine in this context was never interpreted simply as protecting a person. It became symbolic. Protect the schedule, protect the privacy, Protect the institution that depends on both. And perhaps that was why the silence remained intact. No denials, no declarations, just continuation. Because royal stability has often depended less on explaining pressure than surviving it. Still, insiders whisper that survival may not have been the only goal. Some began wondering whether maintaining calm publicly allowed something else to happen privately. Whether the real priority was never controlling headlines, but controlling confidence. Because as observers focused on Catherine's composure, others quietly started asking a more uncomfortable question. What if this had stopped being about individuals entirely? But the deeper story, insiders whispered, wasn't personal, it was institutional. No accusations were made publicly, but absence of comment became its own form of communication. By this stage, the conversation surrounding access restrictions had already escaped the narrow world of schedules and administrative controls. Quietly, almost inevitably, attention shifted toward a more delicate question. What did this mean for Queen Camilla's position inside the broader structure of the monarchy? And according to reports and various interpretations from royal observers, that question was handled with extraordinary caution. Because one distinction reportedly became important almost immediately. Households are not individuals. Staff are not principals. Access is not ownership. For all the speculation surrounding restrictions tied to a longtime aide, no public suggestion emerged that Camilla herself had directed, approved, or even known of anything being discussed internally. Palace watchers repeatedly emphasized that royal offices operate through networks of staff, overlapping responsibilities, inherited structures, and administrative relationships that often function independently of the figures they serve. That distinction mattered, not only because of fairness, but because of what happens inside institutions, when lines between households begin to blur. Reports suggest efforts quietly intensified to reduce tension, before narratives hardened into factions. Administrative language allegedly became more careful. Internal communication reportedly narrowed further. Observers interpreted the silence not as avoidance, but as containment. Keep households separate. Keep interpretation limited. Keep the institution ahead of personalities. Still, institutions carry memory, and royal history has never been untouched by sensitivity surrounding competing offices. Long before this moment, commentators had often described the modern monarchy as operating through parallel centers of influence, each household, with its own advisors, routines, priorities, and internal loyalties. Publicly unified, privately distinct. Usually those arrangements remain invisible, but moments of pressure make invisible structures easier to notice. Reports suggest the discussion slowly evolved away from schedules entirely, and toward something more abstract and more difficult. Influence. Not influence in the dramatic sense. Not commands or secret decisions, but influence measured through access. Who receives information first? Who sees what? Who becomes included by proximity? And where does helpful coordination end and overfamiliar visibility begin? Questions like those rarely produce public answers. But according to interpretations circulating around palace commentary, they can quietly reshape relationships. That may explain why observers increasingly focus not on conflict, but on recalibration. Reports suggest internal efforts concentrated less on assigning responsibility and more on preventing narrative fallout. No one appeared eager to create winners and losers. The priority, according to some readings, was preserving operational confidence before speculation created permanent damage. That required restraint, and restraint can sometimes look cold. No dramatic corrections, no visible distancing, no declarations of loyalty, only silence and small signals. Yet people notice small signals. Palace watchers reportedly began interpreting subtle shifts in tone, communication, and emphasis. Some described a renewed focus around William and Catherine's household autonomy. Others interpreted events as evidence of a broader institutional adjustment already underway. Not conflict. Realignment. Because underneath every headline sat an uncomfortable tension modern monarchies constantly manage. Unity versus autonomy. Appear united. Operate independently. Support one another. Protect boundaries. That balance has always been difficult. And moments like this make the difficulty impossible to ignore. Reports suggest that by now, the conversation inside observer circles had started changing once again. Less attention was being paid to what had happened. More attention was turning toward what happens next. Because if boundaries were tightening and influence was being reconsidered, then this was no longer simply about schedules, aides, or household discomfort. People began asking something larger. Who would define the next version of royal operations? Who would set the rules? And who would quietly inherit the authority to enforce them? Then attention turned to the future. And who would shape it? Moments of crisis rarely create new power, they reveal where it already exists. By the time conversation shifted from aides, access, and internal containment toward questions of future authority, some palace observers believed something larger had quietly come into view. Not a scandal, not a feud. Something more difficult to define and far more difficult to reverse. A change in gravity. Because according to reports and various interpretations circulating among royal commentators, situations like this rarely transform institutions overnight. Instead, they expose patterns already developing beneath the surface. And increasingly, those patterns appeared to lead in one direction. Toward William. For years, public discussion around the Prince of Wales has often centered on patience preparation rather than movement, inheritance rather than execution. But insiders and palace watchers have long suggested a more complicated reality. William's approach, according to those interpretations, has never been built around visibility alone. It has been built around structure. Wait, observe, then tighten. Reports suggest that in the period surrounding these internal adjustments, observers noticed what they interpreted as a more defined leadership style emerging, not louder, not more public, but more deliberate. Fewer voices, clearer channels, more emphasis on operational trust, more emphasis on boundaries. The language surrounding these interpretations remained careful, but the pattern reportedly became harder to ignore. Consolidation, not of titles, of confidence. Sources suggest increasing importance appeared to be placed on a smaller circle of trusted advisors, individuals viewed less as household figures and more as long-term institutional operators. People whose value was not visibility but reliability. Because moments of uncertainty change priorities. Efficiency becomes secondary. Trust becomes everything. And according to some observers, this shift did not feel temporary. Reports suggest discipline and discretion began appearing more frequently in descriptions of internal expectations. Not secrecy for its own sake, not control for appearance, but controlled access, controlled communication, controlled confidence. The principle seemed simple. Fewer unnecessary pathways mean fewer unnecessary questions. To some commentators, the strategy reportedly invited comparisons to earlier generations of royal management periods, when households operated through tighter internal circles and authority moved quietly rather than publicly. Different era. Same instinct. Protect continuity. Protect legitimacy. Protect the institution before explaining the process. And nowhere did those interpretations become more visible than around Catherine's household. Reports suggest observers increasingly described her operation as becoming more insulated, not withdrawn from public life, but more protected internally. Scheduling procedures reportedly appeared more refined. Visibility allegedly became narrower. Public continuity remained unchanged, while private access seemed increasingly selective. That distinction mattered. Because insulation is not isolation, it is prioritization. And in royal systems, prioritization often reveals what leadership values most. Some palace watchers began interpreting all of this as more than a response to one moment. They described signals of transition, not constitutional, generational. The sense that authority inside the monarchy may already be adapting to future realities long before official change ever arrives. No declarations announced that. No ceremony confirmed it. But institutions rarely wait for transitions to begin preparing for them. They prepare quietly, years in advance. That possibility reportedly reshaped the conversation again. Less attention turned toward who had been restricted. More attention shifted toward who appeared increasingly comfortable defining the rules. Because once operational authority becomes visible, people begin imagining the future. And according to some interpretations, the future image taking shape appeared disciplined, controlled, and increasingly centered around fewer points of trust, not because power had changed hands, but because confidence already had. And with every boundary reinforced, one message became impossible to ignore. Royal life survives scandal. What it struggles to survive is uncertainty, because scandals, despite appearances, eventually become familiar. Headlines fade, narratives shift, public attention moves. Institutions built over centuries know how to absorb criticism, withstand noise, and continue moving forward. Uncertainty is different. Uncertainty spreads quietly, and according to reports and various interpretations surrounding the events that unfolded inside royal operations, uncertainty may have become the real consequence long after conversations about schedules and access stopped dominating attention. By this point, observers had already debated restrictions, household boundaries, and changing dynamics. But beneath all of those discussions sat a more uncomfortable reality. Confidence inside institutions depends on people believing limits still mean something. Because confidentiality inside the monarchy is often misunderstood. To many people outside palace walls, privacy can look like image management. But those familiar with royal operations frequently describe confidentiality as infrastructure. It protects logistics. It protects family life. It protects continuity. And perhaps most importantly, it protects trust. Once people begin questioning whether protected information remains protected, every routine action starts carrying unnecessary weight. Reports suggest that internally, consequences may have extended far beyond whatever sparked the original concern. Not dramatic consequences, human ones. Staff reportedly became more cautious. Conversations allegedly became more selective. Informal habits that once existed through familiarity may have started disappearing. People who had operated comfortably inside overlapping systems suddenly became more aware of boundaries. Not because they feared punishment, but because confidence had become fragile, and institutions notice fragility quickly. Sources familiar with royal culture often describe staff expectations using words that rarely appear in public coverage: discretion, reliability, continuity, restraint. Loyalty inside these systems is reportedly measured less by visibility and more by discipline. Know what you need. Protect what you know. Carry on. That culture works remarkably well until uncertainty enters. Because uncertainty changes incentives. People begin second-guessing themselves. They become careful not only with information but with one another. At the same time, public curiosity reportedly continued growing. Observers wanted explanations. Commentary searched for narratives. Speculation filled empty space. And yet the institution appeared to move in the opposite direction. Less explanation, more containment. That contrast created tension. Public life demands openness. Royal life survives through limits. The balance has never been easy. Some palace watchers reportedly began drawing comparisons to earlier periods in royal history moments, when controversy forced internal recalibration long after headlines disappeared. Different names, different circumstances. Same lesson. Trust rarely breaks dramatically. It erodes quietly. That may explain why reports increasingly framed recent actions less as reactions and more as signals. Signals that confidence still mattered. Signals that operational boundaries still existed. Signals that decisions, however quiet, still carried meaning. And perhaps that became the symbolic importance of the restrictions and adjustments people had spent weeks discussing. Not who was affected, not who appeared stronger, but the message underneath: when uncertainty appears, someone must show that standards still exist. Reports suggest rebuilding confidence internally may have become the quieter objective all along. Not restoring appearances, restoring certainty. Because institutions survive criticism, they survive speculation, they survive difficult periods. But they cannot function indefinitely if the people inside stop believing the system protects itself. And somewhere in that realization, the entire story reportedly began changing shape. What started as discussion about schedules became conversation about structure. What started as curiosity became reflection. What started as one unexplained moment became something larger. By the end, the story became less about one leak and more about what comes next. Palaces are built from stone, but they survive on trust. And perhaps that was the strange truth left behind after all the speculation, the silence, the restrictions, and the questions that never received public answers. Nothing appeared to collapse. No declarations shook the institution. No dramatic revelations arrived to close the story neatly. Yet according to reports and the many interpretations that followed, something had changed anyway. Not visibly, structurally. Because by the time the conversations quieted, people no longer seemed focused on discovering exactly where information traveled, or who knew what and when. Instead, attention shifted towards something more lasting, the realization that moments like this rarely end when headlines disappear. They leave traces, small adjustments, new habits, different expectations, and inside institutions built over generations, those traces can become the beginning of entirely new ways of operating. That was why so many observers reportedly returned to Prince William's role in the story. Not because of a speech, not because of a public declaration, but because of what people believed they saw in the response. Controlled movement, measured decisions, an emphasis on protection over explanation. According to interpretations emerging from royal commentary, William's image throughout this period increasingly reflected something larger than family loyalty. He was portrayed not simply as defending Catherine, but as defending the principles surrounding her role. Privacy, boundaries, order. Whether those interpretations prove lasting remains uncertain. But they revealed something important about expectations surrounding the future. People were no longer imagining leadership only through appearances. They were imagining it through decisions. And Catherine remained central to that conversation. Reports suggest her position moving forward became symbolic in ways that extended beyond schedules and public engagements. Through silence and continuity, observers interpreted her role as representing something increasingly valuable inside modern public life, the ability to remain visible without becoming fully accessible. That distinction matters. Because public trust and personal access are not the same thing. Perhaps that became one of the deeper lessons many took from the entire episode. The public may feel connected to institutions. That does not mean institutions can function without limits. Privacy is not secrecy. Hierarchy is not distance. And discipline is not necessarily punishment. Inside royal systems, those lines have always existed. Moments of pressure simply force people to notice them again. Reports suggest quiet shifts may continue long after public attention moves elsewhere. Procedures evolve. Communication changes. Expectations become clearer. Not through announcements, but through practice. That process is rarely dramatic, but it can redefine culture. And if that happened here, then the consequences may never fully appear in public at all. Because institutions often reveal their future quietly, through who is trusted, through who is included, through who receives responsibility. That leaves one final tension still hanging over everything that came before. How do you preserve loyalty without allowing familiarity to weaken boundaries? How do you maintain authority without losing connection? How do you modernize without surrendering structure? Those questions may remain unanswered, but perhaps they were always the real story. Not one aide, not one decision, not one week of speculation, but the constant balancing act required to protect both family and institution at the same time. And in that sense, the aftermath may matter more than the event itself. Because long after conversations fade and narratives change, institutions remember. and people remember who stepped forward when certainty became difficult. And in the silence that followed, one lesson seemed to echo through every corridor of royal life. Access may open doors, but trust decides who remains inside. Thanks for watching. Please don't forget to like and subscribe, and we will see you in next one.